Mr. Selwyn Pieters. How are you?
I'm fine. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon to you, sir. Very happy to meet you. It's actually my first time meeting you. I've been following you on social media. I follow some of your work, and you're currently in the news for one of the cases that you're dealing with, and we're going to be talking about this shortly. But I'm happy to meet you, and I'm happy to introduce you to the viewers of this episode. So I will ask you to please introduce yourself by your own words, and then we'll get to talk a little bit more about what we wanted to talk about here today.
Yes, well, let me say that I'm a fan of the program. I've watched all the episodes with Justice Brock Jones. I've watched Hussein Ali. I've watched um, tons of different programs, the all-female panels. I've watched Mary Heenan. Lots of programs I've watched from your your weekly shows, and so I'm very familiar with the program, and I've found it to be beneficial. Now,
Thank you.
let me say that I'm a litigator. I practice criminal law, civil litigation, human rights law, and constitutional law. I also do inquests. I presided over inquests as a presiding officer from 2021 to 2024. And I've done quite a few inquests into death in custody in various jails in Ontario. Plus, I've done inquests into police deaths or persons who die during police encounters. So I have a significant familiarity with the criminal justice system because of my work in human rights, inquests, criminal law, and civil litigation. I've been practicing law for 20 years in Ontario, but I also practice in Guyana
Mhm.
and Trinidad. And before that, I used to work at the Immigration and Refugee Board as an immigration and refugee protection officer. Um, I've done hundreds, thousands of cases. I've got, I don't know, about 900 reported decisions. But I'm very familiar with corrections,
Mhm.
the Solicitor General's office, prison environment, and what else can I tell you? That's the most I can tell you for now.
Well, that's a lot, and it's a very interesting intersection that you have here, which actually just seems like your whole career was preparing you for this very specific case that we're going to be talking about today, which was supposed to be just a regular, I guess, criminal case, but turned out to be a big, a lot bigger than that because of what happened at Maplehurst. And one thing that we wanted to talk here today about is the case of one of your clients, Mr. Ritchie, who happened to be detained at Maplehurst in 2023, December of 2023, when a very horrific incident happened. It is an unusual incident. It's not like this is something that happens luckily all the time there, but it was enough to just get a lot of attention in the media. And unfortunately, Mr. Ritchie is one of these individuals who were part of that. And you have direct experience then through this case about what was going on. And this is what I would like you to talk to us today about, Mr. Pieters, because of this case that you have. So if you can just give us briefly an outline of Mr. Ritchie's case and then what happened in December of 2023.
Well, Mr. Ritchie was arrested in June of 2022 on an allegation of a homicide that
Mhm.
he was responsible for the death of his partner. And so he was held in custody at Maplehurst in December 2023 because he had a preliminary inquiry that was about to commence in January of 2024.
And sorry to interrupt, at that stage, obviously, he was still presumed innocent, so he wasn't convicted or found guilty of anything at that
That's right.
point.
He wasn't convicted of anything.
Yeah.
And in terms of Mr. Ritchie went to paralegal school.
Oh,
You know, he took a
yeah.
par he took the par he was training to be a paralegal and to be licensed with a law society. His mother is an optician, and his stepfather, who is now deceased, was a jurist. So, um,
A family of professionals
yes, so
and
he
an
it's not
aspiring professional himself.
that's right. So even though he's in jail, he's
Yeah.
well familiar with the law, including the charter. And so in December of 2023, on December 20th to be exact,
Hmm.
there was an interaction between some correctional staff and some inmates who were at the phones. So the inmates were on the phone, and it seems like the correctional officer wanted to get an inmate's attention. So he was touching on the inmate to get his attention. The um, the situation between the particular correctional officer and the inmate escalated,
Hmm.
and the inmate sucker punched the officer to the face. The officer dropped to the ground. The other officer who was there called in a code blue, which is a emergency alarm for assistance. Correctional officers attended the scene. The inmates, for the most part, were cooperative. They all retreated to their cells. That was on HC. They retreated to their cells, and the officers locked the living unit up and removed two inmates who were in the area where the interaction occurred. The inmate who assaulted the officer and another inmate who may have been an accomplice. And the lockup took place, and my understanding is that the inmate who assaulted the correctional officer was almost immediately removed from that jail to the Toronto East Detention Center.
So he was transferred out of
He was transferred out of the jail.
Maplehurst,
That's right.
which makes it even more concerning than what happened afterwards, since the particular individual who was, or inmate who was responsible for this whole incident wasn't even there when what happened later took place.
Yes, because what happened was a whole bunch of misinformation and disinformation.
Mhm.
Staff Sergeant Darren Jones, who was the most senior officer in charge of the jail at the time the incident occurred, contacted the superintendent of the jail, Mr. Winston Wong, and communicated to Winston Wong that the inmates were being very unruly, they were disruptive, and he received reports that there were weapons in the jail. And there was a discussion. So the superintendent then called a meeting with all his senior staff that were available, and him, together with Staff Sergeant Jones, was pushing the deployment or the activation of ICIT, the Institutional Crisis Intervention Team, which deals with unruly and severely disruptive inmates, to be instituted and come into the institution to restore order. So that is what had happened. Superintendent Wong, according to senior staff members, was very emotional about what occurred because
Mhm.
the particular correctional officer, he had a fractured orbital bone and had to be taken to the hospital. So it appears from the report that they wanted to teach the inmates a lesson that you don't touch correctional staff. And so what they did is they took a sledgehammer to really swat a mosquito.
Exactly. And this is the whole problematic in this situation is that maybe there was an incident that warranted some kind of maybe discipline, but I mean, they already knew who the person responsible for this incident was, and they transferred that person out. They could have, did they lay charges at least on that person?
Yes, they did.
Okay, but I mean, like, wasn't that going to be enough to deal with the situation? Why did they, and we will get into what happened afterwards, but why did they have that need? Was it ever explained? Why did they need to go further than that and just teach almost everyone? Because my understanding is that most of the inmates that we see later on the videos and who are the recipient of that horrific treatment were not even in the same unit as that inmate who created or caused this whole situation.
That's
So,
right. Five other units on the eighth floor or the eight pod was affected. So you had 8A to 8F that were affected, and this incident had occurred on 8C. So 192 inmates were affected, and at the most, two inmates were involved.
involved.
So
Right.
190 inmates were affected over something that they had no involvement in directly or indirectly, including my client, Mr. Ritchie.
Exactly. And was there ever an investigation that was made before they made that decision to deploy the whole ISIT system?
No, they failed to follow policy because one of the things that should have been done is a risk threat assessment should have been done. And number two, the regional directorate should have been advised.
Mhm.
That didn't happen. In fact, what they did, and there's a report by the Correctional Investigation and Oversight Body that said they lied to the regional director. They said 8 inmates were affected when 192 inmates were indeed affected over um, 37 hours. Some inmates were locked in their cells with only their underwear.
So let's get into then what happened. So that decision was made. So they kind of bypassed the regular route and they went straight into deploying ISIT. So what happens then, if you can tell us, Mr. Peters?
Yes, so what happened is they would have need time to assemble the officers because remember this is a massive operation
Yeah.
that was going to go on for days. So they had to call the officers out, make sure the officers were properly kitted, make sure they had enough munitions, and make sure they had enough food to feed the officers, make sure they had water. So they decided that this operation was going to happen on the 22nd, 2 days after the interaction between the officer and the inmate. So the officers came in on the 22nd
Of December.
of December 2023. They were
Mhm.
paraded, and the superintendent was part of the parading. And then they were deployed to various units. So
So maybe I can show a video just so we can get an idea about what we're talking about here. And this is just the beginning. So if you can maybe explain to us what is it that we're seeing here?
yes, so you're seeing you saw You just saw some smoke,
Yeah.
which was the deployment of a flash grenade. Um, and now you see the officers from the ISIT unit.
Hmm.
Um, they've um, they've entered the unit that Mr. Ritchie was residing on, 8B.
So this is
And
just one unit.
yeah, this is just one unit, 8B.
And were they doing the same thing in several units at the same time?
No, they were doing it unit by unit. So this
Okay.
is, but they had different teams. This was the team that was deployed to 8B. There were 26 of them, 26 officers in full riot gear who were deployed there.
And 8B is the unit where Mr. Ritchie was staying in.
That's correct. So,
Okay.
some of the officers had pepper ball guns. Some of them had flash guns that deploy flashbangs. One of them had a camera, a handheld camera that was supposed to be recording and capturing audio. Some of them had the handcuffs, because they had different rules. Some of the officers were the arresting officers who would go to the living unit and handcuff the inmates and bring them out.
All right. And we don't have audio here, but was there audio?
There was an officer with a handheld video that was recording, but what happened? This is the surveillance you're looking at.
Yeah.
What happened is the officers, all that sort of evidence was destroyed in order to cover up
Hmm.
what really took place during the operation
And this is
and what was said during the operation.
and this is actually pretty scary because we see that there are a- many officers. I think you mentioned 26
Yes,
of them armed. And obviously, like this is in a detention center where the inmates are stripped of everything. Like where the expectation is that they are not armed, they have nothing on them. And actually, here what we will be seeing is that they're only going to be wearing their underwear, basically.
yes, because what happened here is that the officers, the first cell to the left is the cell that Mr. Ritchie was residing in, and you
Hmm.
can see the overwhelming amount of force.
Yeah,
You can see the amount of bodies of officers that
right.
are outside that cell that is housing two persons.
Yeah,
You can see it on the bottom, the unit
yeah,
below his cell as well, the amount of officers that were there. They were there to overwhelm the inmates. So what they did is they would there's a little meal hatch, they opened that and they put on the flexi cuff, the plastic handcuffs on the inmates, and then they perform a strip search on the inmates. The inmates then are allowed to have their boxer shorts on, and then they move them out of the living unit towards where the nurses are, and then they take them into a hallway where they had them sat for a while they were searching their cells, and not only searching their cells, but they removed all of the inmates' belongings from the cells. They remove all of their belongings. They toss them out, even their papers and their court documents, their pictures, um, their clothing, their sheets, their blankets. So they removed everything from the inmate's cell. And after they finished searching the totality of the units and removing everything, even their canteens that they paid for were removed. They brought back the inmates in the cells with only their underwear. In my client's case, he was without his clothing and just in an underwear for 37 hours. not only that, but it was even more egregious because the units were smelling of pepper spray
Hmm.
and the munitions that they deployed.
Yeah.
It was very so toxic that the correctional officers couldn't work without wearing respirators. Uh,
And sorry, what we just saw here was happening in Mr. Ritchie's unit, which clearly is not the unit that was housing the person, the inmate who triggered this whole situation.
that's right. The living unit the inmate belonged to was 8C, and that's 8B.
Yeah.
The inmates in that unit had nothing to do with what took place.
And was there any kind of like, was the treatment different in the unit where that inmate was housed? Like, was it even harsher there, or was it still the same? To your knowledge, you may not know directly, but to your knowledge.
Well, I know from the reports, the treatment, I mean, the investigations are still ongoing because remember
Hmm.
the investigation that was conducted was an internal investigation conducted by the Ministry of the Solicitor General to determine whether any policies were breached and any disciplinary action should be taken against correctional officers. There's now an investigation that's going to be conducted by the ombudsperson. There's also a call for a commission of inquiry, and questions are being raised as to whether the Ontario Provincial Police should conduct a criminal investigation into the conduct of officers because inmates were assaulted, physically assaulted, and that has not been properly investigated. Another thing too is I should mention this before I forget. The temperature on the living units, the chiller fans were turned on, and the temperature dropped by at least 2 degrees in the middle of the winter. This was December of 2023, and they turned on the cold air while the inmates were in their underwear and nothing else
Yeah.
in the depth of the winter. So that was another severe sticking point.
And actually, on that, maybe we can show them the next video. Just it will show us a bit more. We won't be playing the whole thing so that we don't get to identify any of the inmates, but just to see, to give a picture of what we're talking about. And I know this was published in the Toronto Star, but we'll just, for the purposes of this interview, we'll just play a little bit of this here.
Right.
And we'll
So
just.
so this is a hallway where the ISIT officers brought the inmates, and you can
They're
see
in
that
their underwear.
that's right there in their underwear. They have no other clothing on. They have no footwear on,
Yeah,
no socks on,
yeah.
and
Their
you can
hands are tied.
their hands are tied, and you can see the officer with a pepper ball, or at least two of them. You can see the lights from the pepper ball shining towards the ground at
Yeah,
this point, where the officers did not need the lighting is quite clear. You don't need lighting from
yeah.
any artificial source at this point, but the officers have the light of the pepper ball gun on, and you can see at least four of them surrounding one particular inmate.
And you said the temperature was pretty low here. And again, just to put this into context, this was happening in December of 2023. So it was in the winter.
That's
And
right.
we clearly see them only wearing underwear, not even wearing socks.
That's right. And certainly the condition you see here is synonymous with Guantanamo Bay
Yeah.
or the Abu Ghraib prison. Um, you can see that this is not conditions that would be compliant with the charter. But it's 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 an illegal search at the most, or at the least, sorry, it's denying the clients their rights to life, liberty, and security without a, without any principles of fundamental justice. That is arbitrary detention. It's detention within a prison for no good reason. And it's cruel and unusual
Yes.
treatment and or punishment.
Exactly. And it's taken out of proportion because again, even though there may have been some valid reasons to do some investigation about the original inmate, but again, that person was transferred out. There was potentially another person maybe involved, but clearly everyone else who was subjected to that treatment, I mean, reasonably speaking, or logically speaking, wouldn't be involved in what happened. And so they were subjected to this harsh treatment when there was really no basis for that. So it was really taken out of proportion.
That's right. It was. And, you know, we've got one decision already on it, just as good from the Brantford court. She released a ruling and she was very critical of how the jail officials conducted themselves. We have another set of applications being dealt with by Justice Conlon at the court in Milton. He's hearing the applications of three different inmates who were subjected to this treatment. We also have Justice Wolcombe, who heard Mr. Ritchie's case, and she's going to be releasing a ruling on August 14th.
Mhm.
I mean, not only were the inmates treated this way, um, not being clothed, but they also were not fed for hours on end, um, and not being provided. They weren't provided with their medications. A lot of inmates in those jails have mental health issues or
Yes.
other issues, and some of them are depressed. Some of them are sleep deprived. They have I mean, my client had his own mental health issues and he was denied his medication for 2 days, and the records bear that out. Um, I mean, you spoke about this situation being excessive and disproportionate. It was because Darren Jones spoke to the superintendent about knives being about weapons to harm correctional officers. Yet there was no metal detector used.
Mhm.
You would think if you're looking for weapons,
Right.
you would have a metal detector to find those weapons. And so it showed the arbitrary, that was an illustration of the arbitrariness and the sort of without merit. It wasn't grounded in merit. It
Well,
was simply a ruse.
and just looking at, I mean, we saw in what state the inmates were. They were in their underwear. At this point, it would be clear if they're concealing weapons. Just to take it further, to get them out of their units and to just put them like that in the hallway, like that was, again, like everything seemed to be going a step further. And it was all unnecessary because at this point, it's clear, I think, that they didn't have any weapons on them. I mean,
Yes, it was to humiliate them
yeah,
and it was a disproportionate show of force. I mean, it was meant to intimidate. It was meant to it was meant to bring those inmates, even in their most vulnerable state, bring them to their knees.
yeah. And respect the jail authority, I guess.
Well, not only respect the jail authority, but to show them that you have no rights in here that we're bound to respect.
Yeah, yeah,
You know, you don't follow your own processes, you don't follow your own policies. They destroyed all the audios because remember what they call that jail. they coined a term for the operation, Guantanamo Bay.
Hmm.
We need not forget that they termed that, they used that phrase or that term, and they got it from Guantanamo Bay.
Yeah.
And they had to be watching videos of the treatment of prisoners, whether it's in El Salvador or in Guantanamo Bay or Abu Ghraib, to treat those prisoners in Ontario like that.
And that's the key point, right? Like this is a prison in Ontario where we're witnessing that. And that's why this was shocking, because I think it came as a shock to anyone who watched that video that this was happening here in this country. And with people who are charged here essentially with criminal charges. Like we're not dealing with terrorism. I mean, maybe there are one or two, but that was not the issue. It wasn't even a question of terrorism. It was just an incident between an inmate and a correctional officer that escalated. And then we had this huge response. But my question to you here, Mr. Peters, and that I would like you to tell us a bit more about is how did you get to know about what was going on?
Yes, thank you for asking. I actually made an appointment to see my client on December 23rd.
Which
So I
is the following day.
That's right,
Hmm.
because we had a preliminary inquiry coming up in January of 2024. So
Yeah.
I wanted to see him before I took off on holidays because I was
Hmm.
going to the Caribbean for
The
until the
holiday
New Year's.
season. Yeah.
Yes. And so I went on the 23rd to see the client, showed
Yeah.
up there at 5 o'clock in the evening for my 2-hour visit. And a staff sergeant came down to see me to tell me that I wouldn't be allowed to see him because there was an ICIT operation, and he does not think that ICIT would release Mr. Ritchie so that I could see him. So
And
I,
sorry, but when you were told an ISIT operation, did they tell you why they were having an ISIT operation?
no, the staff sergeant didn't tell me why they were having an ICIT operation, but from my own knowledge of correction, an ICIT operation in my mind would have triggered some form of disruption
Hmm.
within a living unit that would cause the riot unit to be deployed.
So you get that information, then what happens?
I left and I returned to my place of abode. I documented that I was at the jail and did not get to see the client. When I got back from holidays, I got a phone call from the client telling me the true nature of what had took place
Hmm.
over the holidays at the jail. He complained that he was denied his medication, that he was denied food. He complained that he was roughed up and twisted up by the jail guards. And I went to see him. He provided me with a copy of his inmate statement. I filed a request for his unit file, so all his medical records and everything, and it showed that he was denied his medication for 2 days. Um, we received information about the ICIT operation, and so I commenced an investigation into what occurred. I subsequently filed a charter application to have relief under the charter for what took place at Maplehurst.
And when your client told you about what happened, so did he explain in detail? Like, did he tell you exactly like what he was subjected to, or is this something that you slowly discovered as you were doing your own investigation?
Well, at first, to be quite frank with you, and my client is going to be upset when I say this, I was skeptical about the full extent
Right.
of what took place at Maplehurst.
When he was telling you, right?
Yeah, I did not believe that all this can happen in a jail in Ontario,
And
especially
and
Maplehurst.
this is the thing. This is what I find because sometimes we have clients, they call us when they're detained and they say things. Sometimes they exaggerate. It's not as bad. And sometimes it is true. And this unfortunately was true, but it was even worse, maybe, than what your client was telling you. And I think this is why it was very difficult to kind of really grasp the extent of this incident because it's actually whatever he told you. I'm sure that once you saw the videos, it was worse what you saw than what you heard directly from Mr. Ritchie, right?
Yeah, when I saw the videos, I was very disturbed, and
Right.
you haven't really shown the videos like some of the videos like CBC the National showed one of them, and that one was bad. Um, the videos have been bad. The reports from some of the correctional managers that speak to the cover up was bad. Um, I I did not believe it was that bad, and so it took me a while to really act on Mr. Ritchie's concerns. But I acted on those concerns, and I acted very um, tough
Yeah.
because I'm seeking a reduction of his sentence to the minimum parole eligibility required based on what took place. And we're also going to launch a civil action
Against
against
Maplehurst.
the Solicitor General and the Government of Ontario. You can't sue Maplehurst itself. You have to sue the Government of Ontario. It's the government who is responsible for that jail.
And so, okay, so let's get then a bit into that because there has to be consequences to what we saw. I mean, hopefully this is something that is unusual and it's not something that happens often in jails, right? How would we know unless, inmates are just informing their lawyers and like you said, sometimes it's difficult to believe because it just sounds so unreal that sometimes a lawyer may get that story from a client and just think that this is an exaggeration or it's a hallucination. How can that be true? But then we saw the videos capture what happened, and there's no doubt that this did happen. And the inmates are hopefully also going to get a proper reduction of sentence, or that will be taken into account in the treatment of their cases. But we still remain with the question of, but what about the institution and the system? We don't want this to happen again. So tell us about what you know about what's going to be happening as another step now that this has been exposed. It's been on the playing on the media. Uh, what should happen next?
I'll tell you what has happened so far.
Okay.
So the superintendent of the institution is no longer there,
Okay.
Mr. Winston Wong. Him and the ministry parted ways. We know that he was suspended from duty, and it's either he resigned or he was terminated, or there was a package given to him. We know that there were allegation meetings. So it's in the CSOI, or the Correctional Oversight and Investigative Service of the ministry. They produced two different reports, and they found employment related culpability on the part of some correctional officials. And we know that there were disciplinary hearings for officers um, and managers involved, and some of them were disciplined. But that is definitely not enough.
Yes.
There has to be accountability on the part of the entire system, and part of that comes through the civil litigation process. There also has to be relief, constitutional charter relief for the inmates. The inmates before Justice Conlon, they're seeking a stay of their proceedings, which means that their trial has not taking place and there's no finding of guilt or no guilty pleas in their cases. So the three inmates before Justice Conlon, or the three individuals, Justice Conlon is hearing evidence and he should have a ruling at some point in August, September, whether he's granting a stay or what remedy he's going to be providing. Justice Welcome, there's no doubt that she's going to be reducing Mr. Ritchie's sentence. And what is to be determined at this point is what sort of violations she finds outside of Section 8
Yeah.
and what remedy in terms of sentence reduction she provides him. In terms of the class action lawsuit, there's a class action lawsuit on behalf of all the inmates, but not every inmate needs to be part of that. Some inmates feel that the class action lawsuit is not going to provide them with an effective and adequate financial remedy. So some inmates have hired their own lawyers. There are about 15 different law firms involved at this point, outside of Goldblatt, who is in the class action lawsuit. There are lawyers who have launched individual lawsuits between $1 million to $2 million on behalf of individual inmates who were at the institution at the time and subject to the treatment that was meted out to them. The ombudsperson is going to do an investigation. When the ombudsperson does an investigation, he's going to be able to make system-wide recommendations in respect to the ICIT unit, in respect to oversight of the ICIT unit, in respect to what should be done so that this does not reoccur in the future, safeguards as it will.
And to your knowledge, Mr. Pieters, is this something that happened? I mean, did this happen before, or is it a one-off, or is this something that probably happens and we're not aware of it?
Was a one-off to the extent that 192 inmates were
Okay.
affected, but you've had this situation, you've had inquests, for example, that made recommendations in respect to ICIT. For example, there was an inmate at one of the institutions, I think it was Central East Detention Center, the Fakari inquest.
Yes.
Anita Spaghetti and Rick Frank were on your
Yeah.
program. You interviewed them
Yeah.
and they spoke about the Fakari inquest.
Yes.
Yes, that was a difficult inquest, and ICIT was involved in respect to an inmate, and the inmate died. But that was one inmate. It wasn't units affected, but the coroner's jury made recommendations in respect to ICIT in that particular inquest, and safeguards and oversights that should be implemented. I mean, in this particular case, you had the officer should have had a handheld recordings that followed the inmates throughout the course. What they did is they took the handheld recorder and put it in the corner of the living unit, put it static in one corner, and even that wasn't sufficient. They destroyed that evidence
Hmm.
that was captured.
Well, that which leads then to the question of like if there were already some jury recommendations at inquests to avoid these types of situations, and this is still happening, what's the point of having these recommendations if they're not going to be implemented?
Um, yes, so the recommendations from inquest, usually the ministry responds to the recommendations.
Hmm.
When a coroner's jury make recommendations, then the regional coroner sends it to the ministry, gives them 30 days to respond to the recommendations. They respond to the recommendations, and sometimes they implement the recommendations. Sometimes they say, well, hey, we don't think this recommendation is practicable or practical. So you have to put pressure on
Right.
the institutions to,
Implement
yes, for
those recommend,
example,
but how?
um, sometimes it comes from the public, it comes from the ombudsperson, it comes from advocacy groups. For example, the local case where that black guy was shot by the police in Toronto within 90 seconds after the police went to a home that was for people with mental health issues, and Mr. Loco had a hammer in his hands. The officer took no steps to de-escalate, but shot the guy within 90 seconds of arriving. The jury made a whole bunch of recommendations, and Toronto police were forced to implement those recommendations because there were the Black Lives Matter protests where people had sit-ins outside of police headquarters for days and weeks on end. And then there was a Black Action Defense Committee, there was a Black Legal Action Center, all those different advocacy organizations that showed up to make deputations. There was Anita Segeti's group, the Empowerment Council. All of them showed up to make deputations before the Toronto Police Services Board and force Toronto Police hands in terms of implementing those recommendations. And the same thing has to happen with the Solicitor General. And there are now organizations such as Tracking Injustice. I'm not sure if you've heard of Tracking Injustice, but
Mhm.
Tracking Injustice is an organization formed by a professor, Alexander McLennan, and some various prison prison law advocates, and they're pushing for reform within these institutions, and they're also bringing to light the sort of ills that has been happening in the prison, and to Tracking Injustice credit,
Yeah.
while this stuff was happening at the jail, they were one of the few organizations to make it public in a public way
Hmm.
before it even became public. And the ministry, when you look at the ministry's disclosure documents, they were heavily monitoring Tracking Injustice and what they were saying online about what was happening at Maplehurst.
Now, I do have a question though for you because as horrific as this incident is, and the videos are really very difficult to watch, and I find like knowing that this is happening in Canada makes it even worse. But there are still some people who won't really care that much about this because they will just tell themselves at the end of the day, these are inmates, these are criminals, and it doesn't matter what happens to them. Like there are some people, unfortunately, who won't really give too much weight to this incident. But I think that this is a very significant incident. It's actually almost like a stain on our criminal justice system. So for people who have this way of thinking about this, who or this point of view, how would you respond to them?
Well, I think the response could be multifaceted, but one
Mhm.
one of the response that I would prefer is that inmates in Canada, we don't have the death penalty. We don't have life sentences except for first degree murder and second degree murder. And what it means is that most of the persons that were affected by the ISID operation are going to be released in society. Secondly, the trauma that the inmates went through, some of them are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder as a result. When you treat people that way, and when you treat people in a way where the rule of law does not matter, and when society takes the posture that it's a jail, anything goes in there, the rule of law does not matter, the charter does not matter, the inmate's right does not matter, their
Mhm.
dignities
Yeah.
should not be respected. You have to ask yourself, how do you expect them to respond in society when they respond when they're released into society, you have to interact with those inmates or those individuals who are now released into society. And the same way, the same posture that the jail guards take towards them, they can be released into society and inflict that same terror on society. So you who are you who are saying that they should be treated anyhow, you can be subject to um, the pain that comes from post-traumatic stress disorder on the part of the inmates. As well, you have to look at the presumption of innocence. Anyone can be arrested.
Exactly.
Anyone could be detained on a false allegation.
Yes.
A lot of the allegations that are made within the criminal justice system are proven to be false. Sometimes people weaponize the criminal justice system against other individuals, and sometimes people are denied bail depending on who the justice of the peace is that sits on that bail hearing. Bail hearings are supposed to be, bail is supposed to be granted on primary, secondary, and tertiary grounds. Sometimes people are detained for no reason. Sometimes people are it's today's Friday. Today's Friday, right? That's
Yes.
when we're doing this interview. Somebody could be arrested today, and they go before the jails are the bail system is overwhelmed, and so there can't their case doesn't get reached tonight. They come back tomorrow, their case doesn't get reached, and they're remanded until Tuesday for a bail hearing, or the Crown asks for a special bail hearing and asks that it be postponed for 2 or 3 days for them to investigate. And the person is put in jail, and more likely Maplehurst.
Yeah.
It is possible that there are persons who were at Maplehurst who were there just for a few days. They just happened to be remanded at that point
That
when the
time when,
situation.
yeah.
Yep. So, and it could be your family. It could be, when I say your family, the General John Public and Jane Public family, it could be any person's family. So, sometimes because something didn't happen at your front door doesn't mean that it wouldn't occur that somebody in your family, a bunch of teenagers may be hanging out 18 years and over, and something happened, and all of them are arrested, detained, and they're placed into custody.
Yeah. Yes.
You know, Mr. Ritchie's case, where he was detained on a murder case, he wasn't. He his stepfather determined bail. His stepfather was a jurist for over 20 years. I don't think his parents would have even dreamed that Mr. Ritchie would have been in that situation.
And I think that this is a very important thing that you're mentioning here is that people don't realize that anyone can be exposed and dealing with the criminal justice system. And until that happens, that's when people suddenly change their views, start to become a little bit more interested. But we shouldn't wait until that point. And even if you're not involved yourself, we should still be concerned about the well-being of the individuals who are there because, like you said, they still are human beings. They still deserve to be treated with dignity as humans, regardless of what they're um, accused of or allegedly have done. That does not strip away their humanity, and the concern should and the treatment should still be humane, even while they're in custody. And I think that that's really very important. This is why this was really very shocking, this whole incident, because they really weren't treated like human beings. And just seeing it in video is what makes it even horrific. And again, the fact that this is happening here in Canada is what makes it really outrageous. So it seems like you will be receiving a decision soon in August in Mr. Ritchie's case, and I will be very happy to follow up with you, Mr. Pieters, to see what's going on. And since this is still an ongoing situation, the investigation is still ongoing, right? Like in these
Yes,
cases.
yes, the investigations are still ongoing.
So maybe then we can continue this interview and chat more about what happens. Then hopefully we'll have a good decision in Mr. Ritchie's case. And I will be curious to see how Justice Wilcombe will decide that case.
Well, Justice Holcomb is usually a careful jurist, and she usually writes well, and so her decision is going to be the first decision that's going to be released that comprehensively addresses the December 20th to December 24th issue, unless Justice Conlon releases his decision before hers. So I expect that it's going to be well reasoned. I expect that she will take her time and she will consider everything that's before her, because what you said is important. You didn't use these words, but summarizing what you said, and jails are expected to be lawful institutions, and officers in the jails are required to perform their duties in accordance with the law that guides them. And
Right.
I think what you're saying is that the enforcement of rules in the jails must be lawful. The enforcement, lawful law enforcement. I think
It
I
doesn't
think that
change in a
summarizes.
jail. Yeah, it doesn't change. It's not because we're dealing with inmates that the law doesn't apply, the charter doesn't apply, human rights cease to apply. Everything is still applicable. We're still dealing with human beings. And again, the videos, what we see there is that we question, like, do they realize that they're dealing with human beings when they were doing all of that? So I know like the videos are not a happy note to end on, but at least uh, it was very nice to have this very interesting chat with you, Mr. Pieters. It was a heavy conversation, but it was really very interesting, and I look forward to what will happen next in these cases, because this is something that I think now got the public's attention because of how significant this incident was.
Yes, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to me on this important matter, and I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And this is to be continued.